Hello, I'm Sherry Vegas, and in this instructional tutorial I'm going to be talking all about bubbles in resin. So I'm going to be going over the ways that you can prevent getting bubbles in your resin and what to do once you do have them, so that way you can get crystal clear castings of resin every single time you use it. The first thing that I need to talk about when we are talking about getting rid of bubbles in resin or preventing bubbles is the type of resin you're choosing for your projects. There are two main types of epoxy-based resin that artists like to go for when you are creating pieces. You've got your first one, which is your art resin. It normally comes in equal parts and it's a 1-to-1 ratio. This is ideal for going across surfaces and gripping to them. And then there's casting resins that a lot of artists like to use. You'll notice with pretty much all casting resins, it comes in a 2-to-1 ratio instead of a 1-to-1. And this is designed to be poured into a mold instead of on top of a surface. The main difference behind these two resins is one is designed to be a lot more fluid and thin, and the other one is designed to be a lot more thick so that way it will grip. The thicker resin generally gets a lot more bubbles because you have to mix it more and it's just prone to that. But that's okay because when you pour it across a surface, it's not going to be poured that deep, and a lot of the time you'll be adding pigments and colors into them when you're creating your artwork, which disguises a lot of those bubbles. So I wouldn't necessarily use an art resin that's 1-to-1 ratio to go into a mold because it's just not designed for that and you're going to get a lot of bubbles. But your casting resins, because they are a 2-to-1 ratio, they're designed to be a lot more fluid, and they will also means that they have bubble releasing agents to it. Because the resin is so fluid, the bubbles have the opportunity to come up to the surface and pop. So that's why if you are going to be doing any work that is deeper than 1 centimeter and going into a mold, you want to make sure you have an epoxy casting resin instead of an epoxy art resin. So getting the right resin is going to make a massive difference when you are having issues with bubbles. Now, the next important tip to reducing bubbles in resin is how you mix it. You want to make sure you mix your resin really slowly. So the manufacturer generally recommends around 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, depending on how much resin you are mixing up in the one go. The next thing I need to talk about is how to mix the resin. This will make a huge difference when it does come to getting bubbles in your resin. If you mix it really slowly, you're going to get a lot less bubbles than if you mix it up super vigorously, because you'll be whipping air into the resin, which will then cause it to get really bubbly. Most manufacturers recommend 3 to 5 minutes mixing. Generally, I put on like a slow, soft song and I kind of mix the music. I find that it does help me a little bit. It can be a little bit frustrating if you are trying to mix up a lot of resin, but it does make a really big difference, because if you can obviously prevent bubbles, then you don't need to worry about getting the bubbles out. You will still get a little bit of micro bubbles when you are mixing. That just happens. There's no way to prevent it, but you won't get massive air bubbles that you will if you mix too vigorously. Another great tip when it comes to mixing is use all plastic. You can use wooden paddle pop sticks, but because they're really textured and they do contain a bit of air because it is a wood product, you're going to get a little bit more bubbles than what you would if you use a plastic stirring stick, just because plastic will not be adding in any extra air to that resin. Now, if you did get impatient when you were mixing your resin, or you just found that you got tons of bubbles even though you were mixing slowly, one of the best tips you can have is just to let your resin sit before working with it. Bubbles will naturally want to rise to the surface, so generally if you're working with an epoxy resin, it's got a long working time compared to other resins, and you do have a bit of time just to let it sit there and let those bubbles come up to the surface. Something else you need to consider if you are getting bubbles in your resin is the temperature of your room. So resin really likes a comfortable temperature of around 24 degrees. So if you are in a cold climate, or it's currently winter where you are, and it is colder than that, you're going to find that your resin is thicker than normal because of that temperature, which means you're going to have to mix it a bit more, which can cause more bubbles because of the thickness to do with the resin. So If you're working in a really hot temperature, you'll find that your resin actually doesn't get as many bubbles as it will if it's in a cold temperature, and that's because the resin is more fluid because it's hotter. So a few tips that if you are working in somewhere cold is, one, you can do a warm water bath for your resin, which will help bring up that temperature and which will mean that you'll get less resin bubbles when you do mix it. You could also use a heat gun to heat up that temperature, or a heat pad. They all work in the exact same principle, where you're just adding a bit of heat to warm that resin up to make it more fluid, so that way it mixes easier. So I just mentioned before about heat and resin. Another great way to get rid of bubbles, especially if you are just doing pours over the top of your surface, is using a blowtorch or a heat gun. By adding heat, it helps make the resin a bit more fluid, which then allows the bubbles to come up and pop. Obviously, if you are doing a really deep pour, your heat gun or your blowtorch might not be able to penetrate the full way down, so that is something to consider. Generally, I only use my blowtorch on when I'm working with my 1:1 ratio art resin, because it's just going across the surface, and that allows my blowtorch just to hit all of that resin because it's not too deep. When I am casting, I do have to do a few other tricks and techniques because I don't like to use my blowtorch when I'm casting. You can use a heat gun. You can also let your resin bubbles all come out before you pour. Another great tip for bubbles in resin is by spraying alcohol spray across the top of your resin after you've poured it. This is great when you are casting with resin. What will happen is it will break the surface tension by spraying the alcohol, which then allows the bubbles to come up to the top. And because you are spraying an alcohol across the surface, it will not affect the way the resin sets, as long as you don't go too crazy with it. Just a few light sprays, because the alcohol will evaporate from the resin. I would not recommend using a water spray, even though in theory it sounds the same, because all we're trying to do is break that surface tension across the resin. Water and resin do not mix, so an alcohol spray works really well. But just make sure that you don't go too much on it, because it can leave a funny residue on the top of the surface of your resin. And my last tip for bubbles in resin is invest in a pressure pot. A pressure pot is a professional tool for resin artists. So they are not cheap, and it generally is only for people who are making quite a lot of items that they are deep casting, because it helps speed up the process and gives you crystal clear resin every single time. Pressure pots aren't for everyone because of the cost involved, because you do also have to have a motor with them to run a pressure pot. But if you are really getting into resin and doing deep casting paperweights and stuff, it is definitely something to look into. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I hope this has really helped you out with having bubbles in resin, with how to prevent them and then how to get rid of them. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. That really helps my channel out, and it lets YouTube know to share this video with more people, and the more people that see my video, the more content I can create. If you are new to my channel, please feel free to subscribe. It really helps me out. I'd love to keep growing this channel, so that way I can keep creating more content for everyone. Thank you guys so much for watching.